Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Kress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in. We'll continue in the Ark and the Dove, the investigation of the Maryland colony and the dynamics that brought about the Carroll family's control of the Maryland colony, which will lead to help us understand how Catholicism got an early grip on our American government, and how we got from colonial period when Catholicism was at times even persecuted in this country to a period of time today when the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican, particularly the papacy, controls our government. But backing up a few sentences for continuity purposes this morning, we're talking again about Charles Carroll, the first Charles Carroll, and it says the continuance of Irish immigration was brought about largely by Charles Carroll, and it was a source of great disturbance to Governor Seymour. Let me just explain that there was a time when Irish Roman Catholics flooded into this country, and this happens to be the first example that I'm aware of in history where the Carroll family, who were prominent blue blood Irish Roman Catholic family, well-connected, well-educated, well-married, and well-bred, and privileged Roman Catholic family, came to this country and helped other Irish Roman Catholics move to the colonies. And throughout history, early American history, Irish Roman Catholics were used to help populate the large cities and to gain political power and influence for the Catholic Church in early American history. So it says the continuance of Irish immigration that was brought about largely by Charles Carroll was a source of great disturbance to Governor Seymour. He pointed out that the root of quote-unquote evil was the fact that the owner of the soil was the Lord Baltimore, whose agents give great encouragement to their seeding here, unquote. Carroll, he indicated, had been particularly active. He suggested that more radical measures would have to be taken than mere duties poll to keep these Catholics out. Quote, unless something more effectual be ordered by Her Majesty, this province will by far have too large a share of them who in some few years may prove dangerous. So here you see the prominent Protestant opinion based on the history of England, what might happen in the colonies were there to be a great population of Catholics, that Catholicism and popery would gain an ascendancy and become a great danger in the colony. And it says how dangerous the coming of Catholics was to Maryland is shown in the early pages of the history of the colony. A tax of 20 shillings was imposed on every Irish Catholic immigrant, and in Governor Hart's time the duty was raised to 40 shillings. All Protestants came in free, and when convicts were imported at a later time, 20,000 of them during a period of 20 years, they too came in free. So Protestants had privilege in the colonies, Catholics were taxed. Catholic immigrants were taxed to try to quell the flood of Irish Roman Catholics into the colonies. And it says, Charles Calvert, the third Lord Baltimore, died in England in 1715 at the age of 85 years. The government of his colony had been taken from him, but he had kept the faith. In other words, he remained Catholic. It says he had lived to see the spirit of religious liberty supplanted, replaced, by the spirit of religious bigotry, that is, Protestant control, and suppression of Catholicism. They took away Catholic privilege to serve in government and vote and public office. And what was even sadder for him, he had lived to see his eldest son and heir forsake the faith of his fathers to regain the lost government. So as a consequence, one son, in order to regain the colony, changed faith. And it says the First Lord Baltimore's change of allegiance from the Church of England to the Church of Rome had been neither for worldly nor ulterior purposes, but this was not true of Benedict Calvert, the fourth Lord Baltimore, when he changed from Catholic to Anglican. Okay, obviously this was a strategic move, had nothing to do with faith, and it was an opportunistic change of faith in order to gain control of the colony. Now it says, like Henry of Navarre, who thought a kingdom was worth a mass, Benedict Calvert regarded a palatinate well worth communion with the established church, or the Church of England. There can be no doubt as to the real reason for his apostasy. He laid bare his motive in a petition to King George I. In this petition, presented just prior to his father's death, Benedict set forth that he had already renounced his quote-unquote Romish errors and had received the sacrament according to the rites of the Church of England, that he had placed his children who were being educated at his father's expense in quote-unquote popish seminaries in Protestant schools, and then his father, angered by his withdrawal from the Catholic Church, had withheld his allowance and compelled him to live on his marriage settlement for, quote, only £600 a year, unquote. Out of this amount, he stated that he was obliged to give £200 a year to his wife for separate maintenance. Being divorced from his wife, a granddaughter of the favorite mistress of Charles II, he was finding a divorce with alimony an expensive luxury. In his petition, Benedict also recited the fact that the late Queen Anne had granted him a pension of £300 a year out of the revenues of the colony, and at his request he appointed John Hart, the son of an Anglican bishop, governor of the colony, directing him to pay over to the petitioner £500 per annum out of the revenues of the colony. The petitioner further called attention to the fact that Maryland was a proprietary government and would soon be in the hands, at the death of his father, quote, who was now 85 years of age, unquote. The son was evidently anticipating his father's early demise. The closing appeal reveals the real motive for his change of faith. Quote, therefore, because he has taken the oaths of the government as well as the sacrament of the Church of England, unquote, he seeks a continuance of his pension, and further asks that if the royal governor is not to be continued, that the king will send him, Benedict Calvert, as governor of the colony, quote, with a saving of the rights of the patent, which is his inheritance, unquote. Benedict received his award. The pension was renewed. On the death of his father, the proprietary government of Maryland was revived in his behalf. He had sold his birthright for a mess of pottage. The father's allowance to his son, which was withdrawn, amounted to £400 a year. It needs only a little arithmetic to discover that Benedict made a good bargain with Queen Anne. In lieu of his allowance from his father, he received his pension of £300 and an additional £500 from Governor Hart. His net profit for turning Protestant was then £400 yearly. It is difficult to see what legal justification there was for him to have received any share of the revenues of the colony during his father's lifetime. It was a transaction that quite measured up to the modern accomplishment known as graft. The appointment of Governor Hart was made at his request, and the request was accompanied by a demand for a subsidy. The demand could not have been successfully made, of course, had it not been for the change in what the son was pleading to call his religion. It was a mixture of politics and religion that had so often blackened the pages of English history. And our guest yesterday, John Daniel, makes the point that many of the primary historical figures, both on the Protestant side and the Catholic side, used religion for political advantage, and that their religious faith wasn't a primary concern in their lives. And that's partly why there was so much religious bigotry in Britain, because of political intrigue and using religion as a cloak. Now, Benedict Calvert did not live long to enjoy the fruits of his apostasy. He survived his father by only 6 weeks. His son Charles became the 5th Lord Baltimore, April 5th, 1715. As Charles was only a lad of 16 years, whose change of faith had been forsworn for him by his father, no odium can be attached to his name. He was forthwith proclaimed Lord Proprietary of Maryland, and he had conformed to the established church, that is, the Church of England. The government of the colony was restored to the House of Baltimore. It says, thus was ended the rule of the royal governors. Governor Hart, who succeeded Seymour, was for a time continued in office by virtue of the proprietary government. Charles, on coming of age, took over the reins of government. He had enough respect for the traditions of his family to be mildly tolerant toward his Catholic subjects, but he gave little attention to the affairs of the colony. After spending 2 years in Maryland, he returned to England and became a gentleman of the bedchamber, and to take part in the intrigues and alliances of the Crown Prince, doing service, quote, disgraceful even in a court which had to wait for another reign to introduce the fashions of good morals, unquote. He lacked the strength of character to give to the colony of Maryland the benefit of the wise policy of its founders. In the meantime, the torch of freedom had been given to other and safer hands. There are many evidences of the purpose of Lord Baltimore to make the first Charles Carroll his real successor in order to safeguard the family heritage from the treachery of his apostate son. Carroll was virtually the vice proprietary of the province. He was in England at the time of Lord Baltimore's death. Subsequent events indicate that shortly before he died, the proprietary realized that little dependence could be placed on his son, gave his attorney instructions and advice as to what course he was to follow. Carroll remained in England for some time, since he acted as attorney for Lady Baltimore in the settlement of her husband's estate. In England at this time were other Catholic gentlemen who were not idle. 2 papers written in French and deposited in the records of the Board of Trade contain the representations of this group headed by Carroll. These papers indicate the policy asked to be adopted was, quote, to defend against the Protestant aggression, a liberty granted in Maryland by what is called its Magna Carta, unquote. As a result, Carroll was sent back to America with even greater powers than he had before. Before he returned, Lord Guilford, as guardian for the 5th Lord Baltimore, a minor, reappointed him as the proprietary's agent. When Carroll returned to Maryland, it was to find Governor Hart starting on a program of anti-Catholic legislation that would have done credit to a Cecil. Now remember, Cecil was the man behind the throne in Britain who saw financial advantage, extreme financial advantage, in nationalizing the lands and properties that the papacy controlled in Britain, which amounted to about a third of the productive land of England, and return it to the people of England. As John Daniel points out yesterday in a phone conversation that I had with him to help me further understand this period of time, it needs to be reiterated that when Catholicism ruled supreme in Britain, much of the productivity of the land was used to support the papacy, and upwards of a third. The papacy controlled so much of the land that it put the people of Britain in dire straits. And when the Protestant Reformation took place, there were those who were genuine of faith, genuine Protestants, whose main concern was their everlasting life, and they were truly Bible believers. But there were a great part of the ruling class of Britain that saw political opportunity in throwing off the influence of Rome and then taking the landed estates that were controlled and for the benefit of the papacy and return them to British use. And so you see a weakness in the faith of many of the characters in Britain, and the primary motive was to regain the wealth of that 1/3 of the productivity of England. And this was what Cecil's job was. He professed Protestantism, but more important than anything, he insisted that the throne be Protestant, not for any religious purpose, but to gain control of papal estates. It was a opportunistic approach, not a religious one, not motivated by faith at all, but economics and power and influence. And Cecil gained his power and control by maintaining a Protestant or backing a Protestant for the throne. That way he could continue to acquire the control of the papal estates. So here he uses that example of Cecil. And it says, when Carroll returned to Maryland, it was to find Governor Hart starting on a program of anti-Catholic legislation that would have done credit to a Cecil. In other words, this is an insinuation that he saw an opportunistic consideration for wealth rather than any religious fervor. Anyway, I'll continue. It says, a factor contributing to this and subsequent legislation was the firing of a salute from the cannon of the fort of Annapolis on the occasion of the birthday of the Jacobite pretender by some overzealous Catholic youths, one of them being a nephew of Carroll. This was in June of 1716. This single shot alarmed the whole colony, which again reverberated with the cry of a popish plot, according to this author. John Daniels makes it clear that there truly was a lot of Jesuit intrigue, and the Jesuits were working behind the scenes to make it a strictly Roman Catholic colony and to begin persecuting Protestants, denying them political access. And such is the state that Rome has always sought for itself. Total government control and persecution of heretics. And so we see this case of anti-Catholic fervor now replacing the Roman Catholic government, and anti-Catholic laws attempted to be passed. Anyway, this fortunate or unfortunate firing of the cannons sought rumors of popish plots again, since it was one of the Carroll nephews that was involved in this, from the powerful, privileged, blue-blooded Roman Catholic Carroll family. And so, according to this author, the Protestants in the Maryland colony really latched hold of this and made as big a deal out of it as possible to help foment the anti-Catholic fervor in the colony. It says, this single shot alarmed the whole colony, which again reverberated with a cry of popish plots. Governor Hart had the offenders arrested and imprisoned, but Carroll obtained the release of his nephew. There was no plot except a boyish prank, but the incident served as a welcome excuse for more drastic legislation. So if Carroll was involved in anything nefarious here, it backfired. More drastic anti-Catholic legislation resulted. And it says, as long as Hart remained governor, he never forgot this incident, and several times in his address to the assembly, he made a great point of it and took Carroll to task, who being, quote, a professed papist, unquote, should have the effrontery to seek to set at large criminals who had committed, quote, so great crimes, unquote. It was unthinkable to Hart that a Catholic should be given any powers from the Lord Proprietary that might conflict with his own powers. It hurt his pride, and he threatened to resign. He made all kinds of accusation against Carroll, and finally wound up by demanding that he take the oath of abjuration, which was then required of all office holders. This oath no Catholic could take, for it went so far as to require anyone who took it to declare that there was, quote, not any transubstantiation in the elements of the bread and the wine at or after the consecration thereof by any person whatsoever. So they had to renounce the belief in transubstantiation, which they are required by Roman Catholic canon law to believe, without any mental reservation at all. And so this oath was required by Hart for the express purpose of keeping all Catholics out of office. Carroll replied that when the Proprietary appointed him his chief agent in the colony, no mention was made of religion or oaths. The Assembly supported the governor. Both Hart and Carroll took their cases to England, with the result that Lord Guilford mollified Hart by stating that he had no intention of lessening the authority of the governor, curtailing most of Carroll's power. All right, we'll return after this break to the reading of the book, The Ark and the Dove by J. Moss Ives. We'll talk more about it when we come back from the break. You're listening to the Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. Stay tuned for the message, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a left-behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. If you wish to contact me, please email me at tom@seawaves.us. That's tom@seawaves.us. tom@seawaves.us. And also check out the website, inquisitionupdate.org. And if you would like to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program, and we thank Brother Nicholas for recognizing the value of this information and putting it on the air. Now, back to the book, The Ark and the Dove by J. Moss Ives. It's Protestant heart of the colony, the Maryland colony, that is on a campaign to pass anti-Catholic laws to keep Roman Catholics from occupying any public office because of Jesuit intrigue and the same fears that were the order of the day in Britain had now been picked up in the colonies, that the Jesuits were up to their old tricks, and that Catholicism had designs for the colonies and for eventually the United States, and as we see today, those plans are come to full fruition. So these fears are not, as this author would like to paint, unjustified. They're fully justified. And we have history now to record the cost of not being extremely cautious about Jesuitism and about Catholicism in this country. Now they have control of our government. And Hart tried to curtail most of Charles Carroll's powers. And he continues, he says, this was not enough for Hart. He didn't intend to allow Catholics to have any share whatever in the government, either as office holders or voters. He procured an act to be passed in 1718 that the oath of abjuration must be taken by all voters as well as office holders. This was openly declared to be the purpose of preventing professed papists from voting at all elections, and for better security and safety of his lordship's dominions and the Protestant government within this province. So, while this author would like to paint Governor Hart as being heartless and as returning a backhand for what this author claimed the Catholics gave full political and religious liberty to Protestants in the colony prior to this Protestant uprising in the colony, Hart was well aware of the dangers that an unbridled Catholic colony might have for this country, and sought to prevent Catholics either from holding public office or voting in elections, something we wouldn't tolerate today, and something that is seen as terribly oppressive and might even be regarded as a dark blight upon the colonial period. But in light of the reality at the time, and especially the reality in Great Britain, perfectly understandable. Now, Hart's addresses to the Assembly were all very bitter, the author writes. In his address to the Assembly of 1718, he said he had looked forward to be, quote, wholly at leisure, unquote, as the last session had passed so many good laws discriminating against Catholics, that he had been afforded much satisfaction and tranquility, but now his peace had been disturbed because some restless and turbulent papists had persisted in persecuting and defaming him. What these papacies did to annoy and persecute him was to demand an equal share in the administration of the government, according to this author. To Hart, this was inconceivable in a Protestant country. He accused Carroll of being the chief fomenter of the trouble, for he had the audacity to set up the claim that Catholics had the right to hold office, quote, from an instrument granted by Lord Cecilius, but that he believed it had been burned at the State House, and to declare that the Catholics of Maryland would insist upon their rights, and that if Lord Guilford would not admit them, that they would appeal to higher powers. The governor congratulated the Assembly for the quote-unquote many good laws that had been passed, from which he judged that there was a determination never more to give way to a popish administration. As for himself, he was firmly resolved to do all in his power toward establishing, quote, the Protestant interest in this province. So this was a serious attempt to put down Catholicism in Maryland and to install a permanent Protestant government. Now, to the Assembly in 1720, he boasted that he would soon silence the clamors of the Catholics by exposing them, quote, to the lash of those laws that were long since provided against them, unquote. Now he's speaking of those laws that existed in Britain that suppressed Roman Catholicism, made practice of the Catholic faith illegal, and all churches had to be consecrated by the established church, the Church of England, and Jesuit priests were hunted. And it says he had already told the assembly that, quote, as soon as as soon as His Sacred Majesty condescended to restore the new Lord Proprietary on his professing himself a Protestant to his hereditary government, the Papists instantly laid in their claim to be also restored to their former pretended privileges, which when offered to me for my approbation by their principal agent, Charles Carroll, was dismissed with the answer that I would oppose it to the utmost of my power. Hence your troubles had their rise, unquote. Later in the same address, he said that the Catholics could be very happy in the province if they only would, quote, not interfere with the affairs of government which did not appertain to them, unquote. In other words, government does not appertain to Catholics. It said the Catholics could be happy and the governor could enjoy peace and tranquility only if only they would desist from invoking the doctrine, strange to him, of equality before the law. And it says, for the pretense that Maryland was granted to Catholics as an asylum from the rigors of the penal laws of England, this was a position that had amused the world, but Hart was the one to discover that it was only an imposition. The Royal Charter, he said, granted no exception to Catholics for freedom in the exercise of their religion. He then proceeded to misquote and misinterpret sections 4 by asserting that all churches and chapels must be dedicated and consecrated according to the ecclesiastical laws of England, whereas, as has previously been pointed out, there was nothing mandatory in the charter provision relating to the dedication of churches. After depriving Catholics of the right to vote and to hold office, Hart next tried to confiscate the property of the Jesuits. But in this project, there was the question of vested property rights to be dealt with, and Carroll, well grounded in the English common law, stood in the way. Then, too, there were certain rights of landowners under the Royal Charter and the condition of plantation to be considered. The governor, under the pretext of an act of Parliament, giving to a commission power to, quote, inquire of the states of certain traitors and popish recusants, and of estates given to superstitious use, in order to raise money out of them severally for the use of the public, unquote, appointed himself a committee of one to conduct an investigation. Since the days of Henry VIII, the twin phrases of quote-unquote superstitious use and quote-unquote public use had always done service when church or monastery property was to be confiscated for the enrichment of the confiscators. In his investigation, Hart first went to Charles Carroll, Esquire, for information and subjected him to interrogatories. In answer to the question whether he knew of any lands or sums of money that were applied to quote-unquote superstitious uses, Carroll replied truthfully that he knew of none. He replied further that he believed some priests were possessed of tracts of land taken by them under the common condition of plantation, or by those who had paid a valuable consideration, but he verily believed that the yearly value of them was so inconsiderable as hardly to afford a bare subsistence for those who were possessed of them. The answer must have been convincing, for there was no confiscation, although it is plain that this was what the governor had in mind. And it says the first Charles Carroll died in 1720, and during the same year, Hart was replaced as governor by Charles Calvert, an uncle of the proprietary. After Hart had gone, there was peace and quiet in Maryland for a time, and it looked as if there might come again the halcyon days of what the historian McMahon has described as the golden age of colonial existence. This, however, was not to be. The House of Baltimore had mixed religion with politics, and the fifth Lord Baltimore, now coming to his majority, in other words, of age to govern, was not to be guided by the traditional policy of his progenitors. One must now look to the descendants of Charles Carroll to find how the spirit of liberty and equality was to be kept alive until the dawn of American independence. Now we're going to get into Chapter 2 of the book before the end of the program, and it's entitled Charles Carroll of Doregan. It says, the first Charles Carroll died in 1720, leaving a son, Charles, the second of his name and line. The son was receiving his education in France at the time of his father's death. It's not certain what college he attended, but within all probability it was St. Omer's. That he received a Jesuit education is indicated in a letter written by him several years later when, referring to the Jesuits, he said, quote, I have, thank God, been bred among them, and if you do what they have taught you, and not contrary to it, you will be happy here and hereafter, unquote. His younger brother Daniel was sent abroad at the same time to receive his education. It says the father wrote to the boys a year before his death to prepare vigorously for the defense of their philosophy and asked them to style themselves in their theses Marylando Hibernus. The son Charles was not of age when his father died. He had intended to enter the Inner Temple of London for the study of law, but was obliged to change his plans. He wrote that his father had directed him to go to the temple, but he, dying, just as I had finished my philosophy, my friends thought my presence in Maryland necessary, and that I might study the law there. He said, I attempted it, but to no purpose, unquote. Unlike his father and son, he did not have the advantage of a legal education. He returned to Maryland soon after his father's death. The second Charles Carroll has often been referred to as Charles Carroll of Annapolis, but Bishop Russell rightfully contends that this designation properly belongs to Dr. Charles Carroll of another branch of the family. In other words, two branches of this Carroll family in the colony, and that the son of the Attorney General should be designated as Charles Carroll of Doregan, because of his long residence at the ancient manor estate of the Carrolls. And let me tell you, the book contains a photograph of that mansion, and it is extravagant. Hard to be believed that such a dwelling would exist so early in colonial history. The thing must be 300 feet long. It's gorgeous. And when I first saw that, I really began to sink in just how wealthy this Carroll family was. Anyway, Charles Carroll Calvert, who succeeded Hart as governor, died in 1726, and on his death, Benedict Leonard Calvert, younger brother of the proprietary, succeeded him. He was one of the boys who was taken from St. Omer's and placed in a Protestant school. His father was supposed to have forsworn his change of faith, yet he was suspected of being a Catholic. A letter of warning that the new governor would bear watching was sent to Lord Townsend, a part of which reads, quote, the new governor is going to Maryland, an educated Roman Catholic. Jesuits go over there annually to that colony and have placed there much in the nature of convents, and by reason of the little care of the choices of ministers and church discipline, the R.C. increases and spreads not only over all the province, but the neighboring provinces. It says the new governor is made choice of and is going over to his new government with a Roman Catholic commander, unquote. And it says Governor Benedict Calvert was forced to resign in 1731 because of ill health. He died on a return voyage to England. His successor was Samuel Ogle. During the rule of Calvert, the Calvert governors and Governor Ogle, while the 5th Lord Baltimore was living, the Maryland Catholics were not molested. There was a respite for them for 20 years, although during this period of time they were still disfranchised, disqualified from public office, and were not allowed to conduct public worship. Upon the death of the 5th Lord Baltimore, his son Frederick became his successor. The 6th Lord Baltimore was a worthless degenerate. The only interest he took in this colony, which he never visited, was to obtain from it as much revenue as possible in order to enable him to lead a dissolute life. His indifference to the affairs of his colony gave an opportunity for a clique whose religion consisted mainly in being strongly anti-Catholic to stir up trouble. The first outbreak came when Charles Carroll of Doregan attempted to force his Protestant relative, a co-executor, Dr. Charles Carroll of Annapolis, to make a just accounting of certain trust funds. Dr. Carroll, to save himself from liability, attempted to invoke the penal laws of England. Now, these penal laws of England, I'll remind the listeners, were those laws that punished Roman Catholics. Okay. It was the laws that were in place that suppressed Catholicism and that taxed Catholics, and only if they behaved and didn't practice their religion and caused trouble. Now, it says James Carroll of Tingwall and Arundel County made provision in his will for the education of his nephews, James and Anthony Carroll, who were devisees and legatees under the will and were also made executors. They were both minors and had been sent to France to be educated at a Jesuit college. Privileged people to send their kids to Europe to be educated in Jesuit colleges. And it says during their minority and absence, Charles Carroll of Doregan and Dr. Charles Carroll of Annapolis, relatives of the testator, were to act as executors under the will. Dr. Carroll was a Catholic when the will was made, but afterwards became Protestant and was rewarded by being elected a vestryman in the established church, that is, the Church of England, and a member of the Assembly. The two nephews named in the will entered the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order. Charles Carroll, when the Jesuit legatees had attained their majority, was ready to make an accounting, but Dr. Carroll was not. The latter offered to compromise by paying a lump sum of £420 to the heirs. Charles Carroll of Doregan refused to agree to this, stating that Dr. Carroll owed the heirs at least 3 times this amount and demanded an itemized account of receipts and disbursements. Thereupon Dr. Carroll threatened Mr. Carroll with the penal statutes. Now, this Dr. Carroll, who was Catholic, renounced his Catholicity to sidle up to the Church of England, has opportunistic goals in mind, obviously. He says, thereupon Dr. Carroll threatened Mr. Carroll of Doregan with the penal statutes. Now that he's Protestant, he's going to impose the penal statutes on Mr. Carroll. This is incredible. And it says the executors went to Daniel Delaney Sr., an eminent lawyer of the colony, for advice. Delaney gave a written opinion in which he held that the executors were trustees for the legatees and ought to pay the legacies with interest from 1 year after the death of the testator. Quote, If the legatees were in their minority, the legacies carry interest from the end of the year, unquote, he held, quoting further, even though no demand is made because no lapse is to be imputed to minors, unquote. In view of this opinion, there was nothing that nothing that Dr. Carroll could do but to account and pay up. This he did not intend to do. He saw in the penal laws of England against Catholics and Jesuits a loophole for escape from liability. He had written a letter to Delaney trying to influence his opinion. The letter said, quote, I find Mr. Carroll bent on a matter which must, if his ends gain, ruin me. As you are going to give us your opinion, or I would choose advice, I must request that you will make this an ingredient toward giving such. 1. I am appointed governor by the will, which may be proper for you to see during the minority of Mr. Carroll's nephews only, who are now taken into orders and are priests, speaking of their Jesuit training. Number 2, whether a recusant or priest can be the executor. If not, what right has Mr. Carroll to call me to account, or who shall have the residue of the estate, unquote. The doctor, in his fear of financial ruin, brazenly made the claim that no accounting could be demanded by an executor who was a Catholic or by legatees who were Jesuits. In other words, that it was perfectly legal and proper to steal money from a Jesuit. Delaney, who was a Protestant, appears in a very favorable light in this transaction. He did not allow his judgment to be swayed by any such appeal as his client made. He informed the doctor that he would, quote, not make the ability or disability of the legatees any ingredient, unquote, in his opinion. In a letter later addressed to the Speaker of the Assembly, he gave a full and fair statement of the whole case and laid bare the attempt of the doctor to escape making full payment by hiding behind penal laws. He was careful to bring out every fact favorable to the cause of the legatees. He called attention to a threat made by Dr. Carroll that his co-executor, quote, was fishing for the Society of Jesus and that the string might be drawn so tight that it would break. Now, I don't know if I have time to explain this before the end of the program, but Jesuits have to surrender all their physical properties to the Jesuit order. It becomes an asset of the Jesuit order. And so this is an attempt, an accused attempt to go fishing for the Jesuits for property. We'll continue tomorrow on Inquisition Update. Stay tuned for Nicholas Arthur's Cross the Border.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the Scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.